Mute there. Hi, everyone. I'm Bethany Groff-Durow. I am the new executive director of the Museum of Old Newbury. And before I hand this off to Susan Edwards, our current collections and development manager, I wanted to take a moment to thank our members and donors for joining us tonight. It is your support, along with the support of funders like the Mass Humanities Group, which is funding this program through the Bridge Street Fund for Local History, that allows programs at the Museum of Old Newbury to remain free. If you're not a member, please consider joining us. A link to membership can be found in the chat. And you can also please keep an eye on our website, newburyhistory.org, for wonderful upcoming events. Thank you very much again for joining us. Thank you, Colleene Fesko, for being here. And with that, I will give you to Susan.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for a very special program on Martin Johnson Heade and the New England landscape. It's a pleasure to introduce Colleene Fesko. Colleene is a Boston-based fine art and antiques appraiser and broker. She is best known as an appraiser on the hit PBS TV show, Antiques Roadshow, and she's been participating in that since its inception 25 years ago. Colleene has served as a consultant with Christie's in their American Paintings department, and her experience includes 20 years at Skinner Auctioneers and Appraisers. Please join me in welcoming Colleene Fesko.
Thank you, Susan. It's great to be with you this evening, and thank you to all of our thank you to our audience in the ether somewhere. I'm really excited tonight to be talking about Martin Johnson Heade because he's arguably one of the most important 19th century American artists. It was really fun doing research on my lecture this evening because he's such an unusual artist. First of all, his subjects and styles were very different. He was also a deeply peripatetic artist. I mean, his travels were in the United States, in Europe, and Latin America, a tremendous traveler at a time when travel wasn't all that easy. And finally, you know, an interesting aspect of Heade is that by the time of his death in 1904, he was virtually unknown. So we're going to look at a number of pieces by Heade, especially the Marsh scenes. And I hope you enjoy the lecture and have questions for me at the end. Next, please. That Heade is impossible to pigeonhole is really seen in this painting for me. It's called Gremlin in the Studio and was painted between 1865 and 1875. And what's so interesting about the painting is that sitting on the trompe-l'oeil style sawhorses is this absolutely exquisite Marsh painting by Heade. You can see that it's in fact signed lower right. What's interesting about it is the gremlin in the middle of the composition. And this fellow is just not there, but he's an active participant. And what he's doing is pulling down the canvas, draining the swamp, as it were. And the water from the canvas is pouring onto the studio floor. Now, what's going on here? You know, the scene in one instance is, you know, extremely important to his work. So is he saying something like, it's just art, or don't take it all so seriously? Or my goodness, I'm a really, really good artist who can do this very atmospheric scene as well as the technical images that are needed for a trompe-l'oeil. Uh, in this way, and, in this piece and in the others that we're going to show, Heade is arguably the most versatile artist of his contemporaries in the 19th century, doing both the landscapes, the still lifes, the hummingbirds, and the flower still lifes. Next, please. Martin Johnson Heade was born in Bucks County, Pennsylvania in 1819. And his first teachers were the artist Thomas Hicks of Peaceable Kingdom fame, and Hicks's cousin Edward Hicks of Peaceable Kingdom fame, and his cousin Thomas, who was a portrait painter. I just want to back up a little bit and talk about portraiture. While America was deeply America, even before we declared independence from England in 1776, the population of America was always very Anglo-centric. So the styles and trends that were popular in the old country were popular in the United States as well. So in the late 18th and early 19th century, what we have is an interest in portraiture, an interest to a smaller extent in history painting. And in this earlier period, late 18th, early 19th, the
you because they don't want you talking
the
during
in the early 19th century
presentation.
subjects, the subjects
That has nothing to do with the audio that we're hearing, right?
were primarily topographical scenes, and these topographical scenes were actually painted by military personnel rather than trained artists. So they're very folky and not as sophisticated as what was to come later. In fact, it wasn't until 1825 that pure landscape came into being in the United States. So here we have this portrait by Heade, and it dates from 1840. And it's undeniably well done. The addition of the newspaper on the lower right and the colonnaded and draped landscape to the left really add interest to the piece. With primitive portraits, the more accoutrements the sitter had, arguably the more interesting the piece. This piece was Portrait of a Man, was painted in 1840 and is currently at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. This, however, is just the very, very beginning of Heade's career. A world traveler at an early age, he traveled to Europe when he was 19 and settled in Rome for 2 years. His first exhibited piece was, in fact, a portrait in 1841 at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And in 1843, he exhibited another portrait at the National Academy of Design in New York.
No.
Following his second trip to Europe in 1948, his paintings became more sophisticated, moving away from the flat limner style of his early portraits, and he began to exhibit more regularly. This also is when he began moving a great deal throughout the United States, and surprisingly, not spending a great deal of time in any one place. It's pretty interesting to look at his travel log. And this moving around, this wanderlust, is something that Heade continued throughout his life. The next slide, please. In 1858, Heade moved to New York City. And at the turn of the 19th century, New York City was experiencing phenomenal commercial and industrial growth. It was really becoming the metropolis of the United States. And the Hudson River was the highway of that metropolis. The complex relationship between the city and surrounding countryside existed during this time. The epitome of progress and timeless wilderness lies at this very core of the landscape aesthetics and at the very core of the Hudson River artists. So, as I said, Martin Johnson Heade moved to New York in 1858. And not only did he move to New York, he moved to the 10th Street Studio building, which was the bastion of the Hudson River School. The studio building was interesting in that it not only had the studios of acting of professional artists such as Bierstadt and Heade and others, but it was also a meeting place of other artists in general. Critics would come, patrons would come, there would be organized openings. It was really a very organized situation for these early landscape artists to get their names and reputations out there. It was in fact at the studio building that Heade developed his lifelong friendship with the amazing Hudson River artist, Frederick Church. Frederick Church, in fact, gave his studio to Heade at the end of his time there. The painting that we see here is Asher B. Duran's Kindred Spirits. And you know, there are so many wonderful Hudson River paintings, but arguably this is a quintessential example of the style. The two figures that we see are Thomas Cole, one of the originators of the Hudson River movement, and the artist, and the author William Cullen Bryant. What's interesting about this scene is that it speaks to many, many philosophies of the Hudson River School, including the grandeur of the landscape. And by the way, the landscape was a pastiche of the Catskills and different falls in the area. It was not an actual scene. But that combination of this profound landscape, this majestic, this sublime landscape, was really at the heart of the Hudson River School and what they wanted to set across as the American spirit. You know, you had the wilderness, you had the amazing wilderness going up and down the Hudson River, but you also had the intellectual aspect of Bryant and also the great artistic sense of Thomas Cole. So the Hudson River paintings in general were not subtle at all. They were often large. This painting is 3 feet by 3 feet, and really speak to the idea of the sublime of the American landscape. One of the issues that comes up often is that the United States didn't have the great cathedrals of Europe. It didn't have the great monuments, but we did have an expansive and amazing landscape that became in many ways the American temple. It's an interesting story about this painting. It was in 1904, I believe, it was given to the New York Public Library by Bryant's daughter and was there for over 100 years. It was in 2005 that the painting, not without controversy, was deacquisitioned and sold at auction for $35 million. It's now in the collection of the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas. Next, please. there's so many art words, and there's often so much controversy about their use. The painting on the screen now is by Fitz Lane and was painted in 1864. It's called Braces Rock, and Braces Rock, Braces Cove, and is currently in the collection of the Terra Foundation collection. An amazing piece whose artist arguably had an influence, who arguably was influenced rather by the Hudson River School, but who went a step further. And as a generalization that is argued by many, this divergent tract is called Luminism. And just as bombastic and majestic and over the top that many of the Hudson River scenes can be, the Luminist paintings by Lane and later we'll see by Heade are in many ways opposite. The format, for example, is a horizontal format. And there is a quietness and serenity to the paintings that is not seen at all in the Hudson River pieces. The layers of paint are painted on very thinly, and it almost looks as if you're looking through a veil of the scene. You know, I'm a North Shore girl myself, and I'm always amused when non-locals talk about how wonderful Fitzhenry Lane is, or Winslow Homer painting in Gloucester. And they talk about how talented they were because of these light-filled pieces. Well, as we all know, in Newburyport as well, that's our light. We have extraordinary light on the North Shore of Boston. And these artists were just able to capture that translucent pink, that glimmering gold, the dense dark of the rocks that have been there forever. This is a wonderful example of Lane's work. Iconographically, these pieces from the 50s through the 70s are often given a narrative that they are speaking to the United States during the Civil War. Some scholars think of the boat in the foreground, for example, as the ruined ship of state. It's interesting to me that nostalgia is something that we in the 21st century and people in general, whenever they existed, think of as their particular bailiwick. But nostalgia is something that is a constant in evolution, missing what had come before. And in some ways, these Luminist paintings really speak to that looking back and change that was inherent in the growth of the United States and certainly in the turmoil of the Civil War. Lane is a master, but so is Martin Johnson Heade. Next, please. He began painting salt marshes roughly in 1858 and continued to paint them for more than 4 decades. He painted them in pairs, thematic groups, or as a long series. He worked on the marshlands. He also worked on the marshland subjects intermittently, alternating them with other landscapes and tropical scenes. So you'll see a marsh scene from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And later when he moved to Florida, you'll see them there as well. While he'd often included hunters and fishermen, and certainly the haystacks in the scene, the best of his paintings were characterized by this mysterious emptiness that we can see in this painting. The figures in the midground are incidental to the composition and to the mood of the marsh scene. His first pictures of marshes were of the Newbury and Newburyport locales at the mouth of the Merrimack River. It's interesting to note that by the end of his career, he had executed more than 100 marsh scenes, and this body of work represents roughly 1/5 of his entire output. So the marsh scene, theory, narrative, iconography was something that he carried with him throughout his life. This piece is titled, let's see, Newburyport Meadows, and it dates from 1871 to 1875 and is currently at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Next slide, please. These marsh scenes always have very descriptive titles: passing or approaching storm, sudden shower, after the rain, sunrise, sun breaking through. And in this way, he's drawing our attention to the natural forces and the changing weather and light that's inherent with the paintings. You know, he didn't title this Fisher Folk in the foreground. It was all about the movement of light across this horizontal band. Clearly, the Marsh paintings are about the changing temperature and weather conditions of this, certainly not static, but oddly permanent and solid environment. This painting is Sunrise on the Marshes and was painted in 1863 and is at the Flint Institute. Next slide, please. The marsh scenes have a few things in common. One is the horizontal style of the piece and the fact that they're basically made up of sky, clouds, and meadow. Figures frame the direction of the piece and draw the audience's eyes into the composition. And here, for example, the haystack is certainly the focal point of the painting, but it's really an almost abstracted sense of the three planes of composition. And this abstraction is, I think, one of the reasons that Heade's work has become as popular as it has in the last decades, because it's very elastic in terms of what one sees and what one brings to it. This piece is Salt Marsh Hay, painted in 1866 and is at the Butler Institute. Next slide, please. Heade painted his marsh scenes virtually everywhere he went. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and later in Florida. With this painting, the image above, we see the idea of his painting the transition zones between land and water. And because he was able to use, because of the transition zones, he was able to refine his palette in a way that often showed extraordinarily nuances of color. One shade moving slowly into another. So that in many ways, these paintings became something that turned the ordinary into the oddly exotic and the simple into the hyperrealism. This image below is the New Jersey marshes, one of the views of the New Jersey marshes today. And I really enjoy it for the odd, open, crushingly simple composition of the piece. I love the five towers sort of mirroring the haystacks. I think it's a wonderful composition and a really interesting way of thinking about the simple pared down landscape of Heade in the 19th century and of abstraction in the 20th century. Next, please. At this point, I really have to give a shout out to one of the major scholars of American paintings, and that is Ted Stebbins. And Ted Stebbins' monograph on Martin Johnson Heade is really the Bible of the artist. The essays, his essays and of his colleagues are brilliant. The research is amazing. The illustrations are breathtaking. So I encourage you to take a look at the book, because it really describes much more than the New England landscapes of the artist, but also his amazing scenes of hummingbirds and orchids, and also of passion flowers and the more Victorian still lives that he did at the end of his career. What's interesting about Dr. Stebbins' book is that he has an amazing chronology in the volume. And I was looking at it the other day, and what was so striking to me is I've tossed around the word peripatetic a great deal, but when you look at the chronology, he was really an amazing character, and traveled throughout the United States. And it was only toward the end of his life in 1883 that his peripatetic lifestyle finally came to a slowing down, not a closure, but a slowing down, when he moved to St. Augustine, Florida, and married for the first time there, and became part of the Flagler studio system in St. Augustine. He died in 1904. And while he was never particularly well known during his life, I mean, they certainly wrote about him in the monographs of the landscape of the time, but he, excuse me, he wasn't certainly a household name. After his death, he completely disappeared from the art market records of the time. It was only probably in the 40s, around the time of the Second World War, when Americans began to appreciate 19th century American painting again. And arguably there's a good dollop of nostalgia that goes into that as well. This magnificent painting is titled, let's see, it's titled Thunderstorm over Narragansett Bay, and was painted in 1848, excuse me, 1868. Spectacular painting that talks about all the things that we've mentioned before, the differentiated lines of atmosphere and the incredible drama of the lightning strike and the pitch darkness of the water and the ethereal whiteness of the sails. It's really a tour de force of Heade's career. Interestingly, it was included in a museum show in 1943, and that began in many ways the revival of interest in Martin Johnson Heade. It's interesting to point out here as well that this painting was discovered by a dealer at an antique store in Larchmont, New York, and is now proudly and magnificently displayed at the Amon Carter Museum in Texas. Next slide, please. Because he was so peripatetic, and because he was actually a fairly successful at marketing his work, paintings by Heade are often found in places that you would expect and the last place on earth. In writing about some of the provenance of some of the pieces, they've been found in garage sales, they've been found in junk shops, they've been found virtually everywhere, and not in a specific town or country. They're found throughout the United States, which is, in part because he was everywhere in the United States. The piece that's on the screen now is Cherokee roses in a serpentine, in a vase. And I'm showing this because on the one hand, it shows Heade's later style, which were these beautiful still lives that included Cherokee roses and magnolias. Quite different from the scenes of the hummingbirds and the orchids and the passion flowers. These are much more austere, certainly isn't the word, but they're presented in a very different style. So as I said, Martin Johnson Heade's paintings are found everywhere. And I wanted to share with you my discovery of a Martin Johnson Heade painting. When I was at auction, I received a call from a small library in Massachusetts, and they were looking to deacquisition some of the pieces that they had. For various reasons, I wasn't able to meet with them for a couple of months. And when we finally got together, I was taken up to the attic, and the paintings that they were looking to sell were lined up along the walls of the space. And people who, colleagues and friends know that when I see something too wonderful, I actually can't look at it. I just have to look away. I can't take it on. And one of the first paintings I saw when I came upstairs, looking down to the right, was this amazing painting signed M.J. Heade, and was of Cherokee roses. So I looked at it and then I looked away, and then I thought to myself, this can't be. This just can't be. So I proceeded to look at every other piece that the library was considering to sell, and then went back to the Cherokee roses. And it was in very, very solid original condition. A nice size, clearly signed, had a label on the back saying that it was a 19th century American still life painting, but no other information than that. My job in telling people prices is not always glorious. In this case, it was. I spoke to the librarian and I said, this is an incredible, fresh, amazing example of Heade's Cherokee roses. And they decided at that point to put it at auction. It was estimated at $75,000 to, I believe, $125,000, and sold for over $400,000. So it was a very good day for the library, and it was a very good day for Heade. In conclusion, I'd like to read a quotation from another North Shore hero, John Updike. And he wrote this in his Still Looking Essays on American Art about Martin Johnson Heade. His weather is interior weather. In a sense, he was perhaps looking to portray a modern mood, an ambivalent mood tinged with dread and yet imbued with a certain lightness. The mood could never be said to be religious, not an aggressive preachment of God's grandeur, but a kind of Zen poise and acceptance that's represented by the small, sedentary or plodding foreground figures who appear uncannily at peace as the clouds blacken and the lightning flashes. Thank you. And it was a pleasure to speak to you this evening.
Thank you, Colleen. That was a wonderful insight into Heade's work, but also placing him in the context of 19th century American art. And I'm sure that there are people who would like to ask questions in the chat box. So I encourage you to do so. So here's our first question. What other paintings have you found in your travels? If they're all as exciting as that, you've had a pretty interesting career.
Well, being both at auction and on the Antiques Roadshow for as long as I have, I suspect I'm addicted to the chase. Absolutely addicted. I was happy to show one of the Fitzhenry Lane paintings because arguably the find of my career was actually two paintings by Fitzhenry Lane. One was, they're incredibly interesting stories because the first painting was in a home in a suburb of Boston. And what was interesting about it was that we were originally called in to appraise a square grand piano. And as some of you may know, a square grand piano is unbelievably heavy and an octave short. So it's not for a furniture connoisseur, nor is it for a musician. But behind the massive, massive square grand piano was a Fitzhenry Lane painting. And I always preface it by the idea of the piano being in front of it, because the painting that was painted, I believe, in 1865, and that the family had no idea where it had come from, but that it had always been there, had been protected by this giant painting in front of it. So no one was able to, scratch it. No dogs, no cats, no children. It was protected by the distance of this ungainly piece. At any rate, I spoke to the owners of the piece, and I said, this is a very, very special painting, and again in original condition because of its situation. The painting ultimately went to auction, where it received great interest. It was a scene on West Beach in Beverly Farms, and ultimately sold for $5.5 million. The other lane that I had the great pleasure and honor of marching to its new home was a painting that was in California. And I had received a call from the owner of the painting. And they were very circumspect about speaking of it and making any assumptions as to its value, or for that matter, subject matter. So I flew out to California and took a look at the painting. And, again, as I couldn't look at the Cherokee roses, I couldn't look at this painting, because it was a sunrise scene of Manchester Harbor and Manchester by the Sea. Really a wonderful, wonderful painting. Again, in very, very good condition, even though it was hanging over a fireplace, which is arguably the worst place to hang a painting. The painting, as we were packing up the painting, the owner, who was the owner and the owner's family, who originally were from Massachusetts, told me the incredibly interesting story that when the family emigrated from Massachusetts to California, one branch of the family had sunrise, Manchester Harbor, and another branch had sunset. And the last time they saw the other one was lashed onto the top of the car and heading west. So it's still out there. It's still out there. That one sold for $5.8 million. I think it's important to say that right now the American 19th century market isn't as vibrant as it had been. We always hear things about, sort of brown furniture not being in vogue, but what people often forget about that sentiment is that the materials that are around brown furniture, the theorems, the silver, the hooked rugs, everything that goes along with brown furniture, 19th century paintings, is not having its great moment in the sun now. That said, as with every period, the magnificent pieces will always sell. And those two were certainly magnificent.
Oh, wonderful stories. That's incredible. We have another question from, this time from Tom. Tom asks, what can you tell us about the chalk drawings of haystacks near Newburyport that Stebbins originally attributed to Heade and included in his first edition, but later disattributed and took out of his second edition? Do you have any idea who might have drawn them?
Well, if Ted Stebbins doesn't know, I certainly don't. But he didn't have a lock uh, on Marsh paintings or on haystack paintings. In fact, there's a wonderful article that Barbara Novak wrote comparing Heade's haystacks to the Impressionist haystacks of Monet, and how with French Impressionism, the haystacks sort of disappeared into the light, whereas with American haystacks, they always remained formal. I don't know I'm afraid I don't know the pieces, Tom, and I don't know the story of the attribution and the change to not attributing them to Heade. One thing I can tell you, however, is that since Heade has been rediscovered, there are a tremendous number of pieces out there that look a whole lot like Heade, subject matter wise, but are either purposeful fakes or pastiches by another artist. So as soon as an artist becomes as important as Heade does, you're going to start to see a lot of problematic pieces. And that's why this Ted Stebbins scholarship is so important to the integrity of the artist.
Here's another question, this time from Bethany. Would you talk a bit about the impact of the Civil War on Heade's life and work?
I'd have to study a lifetime more to be able to answer that question as accurately as I would like to. He to me is such an interesting character. And again, I invite you to look at the chronology of his life. The travel was incredible. He was in Brazil, he was in Jamaica, he was in Colombia, he was in London, he was in Rome. He was everywhere. And if we think, pandemic travel is difficult, travel then was extraordinarily problematic. Many artists did respond very specifically to the idea of the Civil War, of how the manifest destiny that the Hudson River artists were so compelled and interested in showing was really put on its head. How Heade responded to that, I really don't know. The Marsh scenes with their solemn simplicity, I suppose, could be argued to be speaking to the change that was occurring throughout America. But it's really difficult to anthropomorphize the paintings because he was just so unusual. I was thinking the other day about sort of generalizations about Heade, and I'm not able to come up with any. For example, you can think that from his life and from his paintings that Van Gogh was probably a high maintenance kind of guy, and that Picasso probably wasn't going to help you do the dishes. And I purposely don't have women artists in this idea, because women artists had to do everything besides being artists. But with Heade, there are just so many disparate parts to his personality. I mean, like the first slide of the gremlin in the studio. What was he saying? Who was he talking to? He's just a very, very interesting artist. And some of the scenes, the Narragansett Bay, for example, is so dark and so foreboding. And other scenes, you know, it's the evolution of the artist, but other scenes are much lighter and optimistic. You know, he is someone to be studied and studied and studied, and to be thrilled that his first Marsh experiences were in Newbury and Newburyport. Congratulations.
Looks as though we have one final question, and that is from Carol. How did Heade sign his paintings?
It seems to me, and I'm sure there are variations, that a lot of them were M.J. Heade with a date. His original, the spelling of his name originally was H-E-E-D, and again, for reasons unknown, he changed the spelling to H-E-A-D-E. But I'm familiar with the initials and the last name. And he usually, I mean, there are some artists who don't sign their work, and I'm sure there are unsigned examples of his work. But the major pieces that I've seen and that have been authenticated have been signed. And I believe the Cherokee roses that the library had was inscribed on the back as well. So keep looking for them. They're out there.
Thank you so much, Colleen. This has been a memorable evening. I'd just like to remind everybody that if you're not a member of the Museum of Old Newbury and you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider joining us and look for our upcoming programs. We do about 30 programs a year, and we'd love to have you join us again. And thank you so much, Colleen.
Thank you. I had a lovely evening.